use this framework called SCORE that really talks about, understanding first off, getting specific about who your clients in your market are. And all of these things are going to get better and more clear over time, but we need to at least start with like a basic level of what is your niche, what makes you different, what's your value proposition. So we start with getting specific. How do we increase consideration that people want to do business with you? And that's a lot of times that digital presence, because that's where we're in. I mean, people are going to Google you. They're going to check out your branding and say, do I know you? Do I feel like I like you? I want to engage with you further. How do we leverage other people to reach a bigger audience? Are we nurturing our clients and our prospective clients? Because we know not everybody is going to buy the first time they interact with us. And how do we create an experience that really creates advocates?
Welcome, Model FAs. David DeSalle here, president of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. And today we have Jennifer Hensley with us, and she is the owner of Playmaker Coaching and Consulting. And unbeknownst to us, when we first started chatting with each other way back when, is our paths actually sort of crossed in our prior lives. So excited to have Jennifer on the show. We're going to be talking about branding for financial advisors. There may be a slight marketing tilt to the conversation as well. We have a lot of stuff to go through. It's going to be jam-packed with value. But before we get into the topics, Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. It's great to be with you. As you said, I'm sure we crossed paths in the past and we didn't even know it until we had to leave our former employers to finally really get to know each other. So I'm excited to be here with you. And it's been great listening to all these podcasts that you've been putting on too over the last few years. I know I've learned a ton every time I listen to them.
Well, I appreciate that. And maybe that's a good place to start before we get into branding for advisors. Give us a sense of your background, because we actually were at the same company in different roles. You made a transition out of there. How'd that, walk us through kind of your background?
Yeah. So I was with Northwestern Mutual, for 20 years. Kind of feel like I grew up there with the company shortly after graduating from college, and had worked in the field office on a leadership team where I did compliance, ran the orphan program, kind of anything, they kind of toss you into at one point or another, and then wanted to keep growing. So I had the opportunity to come work at the corporate headquarters. So moved and said, let's see where this goes. And was kind of in a rotational roles for a period of time to learn everything there was to deal with Salesforce and distribution. So worked in practice management and compliance some more again, and certainly then in marketing for a number of years. And finally got to the point where I just felt like, after sitting in so many different meetings and working with so many advisors over the years, that there were some things that were missing. And I felt like there was a different way that I could help them. And when I thought about taking, what I had been doing for so long and starting my own business, there were a couple things that concerned me. One was like, how do I really prospect authentically? I remember talking to my coach early on when I was thinking about starting my business, and I was like, are people going to even remember who I am? I mean, Jennifer's a very common name, right? They're going to be like, Jennifer who? And I thought there had to be a way to make things easier rather than just always picking up the phone. And I knew that was what advisors were asking themselves too. And then how do I build a business around the things that I really love doing and what I feel like I can help people with the most? Because we all want to play our position and do what we do best. And then just how to help more people. I was limited on how many people I could help in a corporate setting, but I wanted to make sure that as I was helping people, I could give them both those quick wins, as well as something that would really help them long-term. So they didn't come back later on saying, oh yeah, I segmented my clients or I updated my website, but now I haven't touched it in 5 years. Like, why did I even bother? I want to make sure that they had something that they really felt would give them long-term value. So I knew my story and some of the things that I was asking myself wasn't unique, that advisors were struggling with those same things. So I want to make sure that they would walk away with, something that helps them to really have a lead generation process that would give them more flexibility and more control, and that they could really feel comfortable and confident owning their niche. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about branding as we go today, and also having that system so that as their team grows and evolves, their marketing and their branding and everything can grow and evolve and support them in a way that really works for them as things change constantly. And we've learned that more than ever in the last few years.
Yeah. And I really like and want to go back to just to emphasize something that you breezed over quickly, but I'm always super proud of people. And there's a lot of advisors who find themselves in a similar scenario that you alluded to. Super pumped for people when they've been in a W-2 employee style job for X amount of years. In your case, I think you said 20. And then you had the courage and the boldness to be able to, take the leap of faith and bet on yourself. And, I know just having, known you, you also have a family and like responsibilities to where you needed to make this work. So that in and of itself is super cool. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks listening to this episode that can relate to that, because a lot of advisors, get started in the Northwestern style way where it's, eat what you kill sort of, set up. But a lot of folks start off as planners and in that W-2 style role and eventually go off and, start their own thing. So I just think that's a really cool piece of the story.
Well, thank you. I mean, I remember when I actually first started my business, like maybe somebody else could do all the prospecting and I could just help them execute. And I remember my coach too saying like, you just got to get started. And like you said, I do have a family. We have an 11-year-old daughter now. She was a little bit younger at the time. And that was a big driver for me of like hearing her feel like sometimes she felt like she had to be perfect or have everything figured out. And I wanted to show her that, it's okay to not have it all figured out, to take challenges, to make mistakes, and to be able to show her that, I was going to take that leap of faith and hopefully be that example for her. So she's definitely, family's a big motivator for certain.
That's cool. Well, let's get into the topics before we get too sentimental. I started feeling myself sway in that direction there for a moment. But one of the things as it relates to branding is you had mentioned something about like creating some sort of system, like an advisor should create a system. And you have a particular acronym that you use to kind of explain this thought process, philosophy, plan, if you will. I'm going to just kind of stop there and let you take it. Help us understand what that is. And then I'll poke and prod along the way.
Yeah. Go right ahead and everything. So the framework that we use, we talk with advisors around is called the SVC framework. And we think that's really what most advisors are missing. That makes all the difference for them. So it starts with being strategic. And we'll talk about each of these areas a little bit more in depth, but being strategic, providing value in an authentic way. I know one of your recent segments, I know I heard you talking about this too, about, giving away free things, just helping people, genuinely helping them. And then the third area is making sure the C is how can we be consistent with how we're providing that, as well as that it ultimately connects to your overall business plan and your vision for growth. That it's got to start there, that it doesn't feel like it's just a separate thing on the shelf over here that you got to create. So the strategy, being value-based and consistent, connected are the areas of that framework that we think really help advisors, whether they're just getting started or they've been in business for a dozen years. Like that's really what creates more of that ability to make sure that, when they're shooting, going back to what you talked about, like hunting, and everything is that they really have aim and focus rather than just, all over the board and hoping something will work out.
So let's unpack that. Let's go back to strategy, because I'm sure strategy kind of dictates, the majority of that process. So what are things that advisors need to take into consideration when coming up with the strategy? I'm sure like target market plays a role and there's things that I'm not thinking about, but if I'm an advisor, I'm like, hey, that sounds good. What do I need to focus on when I'm at that strategy stage? What are those things?
So a few different things that come to mind. One is we use this framework called SCORE that really talks about, understanding first off, getting specific about who your clients in your market are. And all of these things are going to get better and more clear over time, but we need to at least start with like a basic level of what is your niche, what makes you different, what's your value proposition. So we start with getting specific. How do we increase consideration that people want to do business with you? And that's a lot of times that digital presence, because that's where we're in. I mean, people are going to Google you. They're going to check out your branding and say, do I know you? Do I feel like I like you? I want to engage with you further. How do we leverage other people to reach a bigger audience? Are we nurturing our clients and our prospective clients? Because we know not everybody is going to buy the first time they interact with us. And how do we create an experience that really creates advocates? So we look at each of those areas and we start with kind of self-assessing of where we're at. Our goal working with clients is to always get to everybody to at least be on a 10-point scale, a 6 or better. Like, hey, we need to at least get there. So if you're not a 6 or better, let's start there. And certainly on that side of understanding who your clients are and your value propositions, number one, because the more clear that is, the easier all the rest of your marketing elements become. So we start there and making sure that like, hey, you have clarity and you have confidence. This is who I'm going after. With one of the clients we worked with recently, Amy, she kind of defined her best clients as her, revenue, based off of revenue, as a lot of people do, and her top paying client. And then as we went through some of her client analysis and talked to some of her best clients, she finally got to the point where she accepted, like, no, they're not my A+. I don't want to replicate some of those people, that I don't enjoy spending time with them. But the dentist and the people in that space that she loved working with were the ones that she wanted to continue to replicate. And once she, came to that realization and then started asking for it, it really wasn't so difficult. Once she decided, like, this is where I want to be known, and now I'm going to go after it. So those are a couple things. And then the last piece I will say, and we'll probably talk a little bit about the playbook for success a little bit more, but the strategy goes with the playbook is that you've got to have a framework so that you know, what do you say yes to? What do you not say yes to? And as you bring on more people in your team, they have something that they can plug into pretty quickly too, to know who's our client and who's doing what and what are we trying to accomplish. And having that strategy in place just makes all of that so much easier.
So I'd be curious to, going back to like the best client conversation with, I think you said her name is Amy, and she had initially said, well, this person, because that was the highest revenue. And I was pulling up an Excel spreadsheet. Well, you did that because I have philosophy around client segmentation. I'd like to kind of bounce this off of you to see if you think about it the same way or different, and if there's a way that perhaps we can combine both of our philosophies to improve it.
Yeah, sounds great.
So I have it on sort of like a point system, and it's all like formulated out in Excel. And if anyone wants a copy of this, just shoot me an email at david@modelfa.com, and just in the subject line, put client segmentation. I'll know what that means. So I have 5 different categories that are revenue, referability, likability, coachability, and potential. So the revenue is straightforward, right? Just where's the revenue? Referability, have they given referrals before, or do they have the potential to? Likability, do you get energy or do they drain your energy when you meet with them? Coachability, do they actually listen to what you have to say, or do they challenge you on everything that you recommend? And then potential, are they 65 and drawing down their assets, or are they 45 and aggressively contributing to those accounts? And I just have it on a 1 to 5 scale for each of those. And the higher the score, the higher the segment, lower the score, the lower the segment. So it takes some quantitative, but also qualitative, aspects. And it's funny how a lot of the highest revenue folks are, B's and A's, but not actually A pluses. And a lot of the folks that are middle of the road revenue score higher on those other ones, bringing them up. How does that compare to yours? Kind of impromptu throwing you this.
Yeah. That was one of the big projects I worked on right before I left the corporate space and everything. And a lot of similarities in terms of what we included in there. I think we may have used slightly different words, like the word like viewpoint of, do they view you as like their go-to person, their trusted advisor, that they're delegating everything to you. But otherwise, very similar ones like potential, revenue, the referrals, those aspects and everything. So we had both those aspects of kind of the financial pieces that are a little bit more tangible that you could measure. And just like you did too, some of those aspects that we are more the behavioral of, like, do they like you? Do you like them? Do you have that strong relationship and everything there? And one thing that we might have slightly different everything in terms of how we approach that is giving the advisors the ability to weight those differently. So that they might say, one particular advisor might say, hey, for me, revenue's a higher part of the equation than their potential, versus another advisor might be like, hey, if I like them, to me, that's much more important to me. So giving them a little bit of flexibility on which aspects of that they feel are most important to them. But then, that makes it, having that format, like you're talking about the Excel formula or something along those lines, makes it so much easier and scalable as they move forward, rather than every time they have somebody like, oh yeah, I need to do this, or should this person be an A or versus this person B? It's like, what do I feel like on the day? Because so much of the work we do, going back to the strategy, is often tied to, hey, they want to work with more ideal clients. Well, we need to understand how many ideal clients are you getting today, and how many do we need to bring in to help you get to your goals? So to be able to start to track that, we've got to have that process in place.
Yeah.
So definitely segmentation is a big part of that. We often work with other people that are experts in the CRM space and have them come in and work with our clients to help them shore that up so that we know once we've identified, here's who your ideal client is. If your CRM system isn't set up to help you be successful, well, we might come up with this great event or this great, marketing campaign or whatever it is, but are we going to be able to execute it if we don't have the systems in place to work with it? So we make sure to bring in those other partners and help advisors make sure that they can carry it forward and not just have another great idea.
Yeah, or have another Excel spreadsheet. It's got to get put into whatever you're commonly on, every single day. What have you seen? So with the SVC acronym, the C is for consistency. And I find that and this isn't just picking on advisors, this is humans in general. Think about how many people, say they want to get in shape. We're recording this on January 5th, and by this weekend, they've already, given up on that. So consistency is something that humans in general can struggle with. What have you seen be most helpful with advisors actually following through on consistency?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things I see is that advisors are great. They often have a lot of ideas of hey, here's somebody at a conference or, another advisor talking about something hey, let's do that. They see something. So they have all these great ideas a lot of times, but then they try to immediately take it on and adopt it all. And I think that's where a lot of times they run into challenges because they bite off, this grand vision and then they can't execute it. Or, what I would see in my corporate days, we'd work on building a plan and maybe take 3 months to build a plan. In the interim, they lost a staff person or something happened personally. And then they felt well, okay, I don't know if this is a priority anymore. And we were starting back at square one. So I think the thing is trying to make it a little bit more manageable allows them to be more consistent. So let's start with kind of what I call phase one. So for instance, we're talking about social media. We might be starting out saying, hey, to start with, I want to just focus on showing thought leadership, not building a community yet. I just want to at least have some thought leadership out there. And it's going to be, a couple posts a week. And let's make sure we can do that. And then what we do is every quarter, every 90 days, I know you're probably familiar with the 12-week year, we adopt the same kind of approach. We come back to it, we review the tape and say, okay, what's working? What do we need to, should we keep running this play? Do we need to add some other things to our playbook now that we're ready for? Or we need to, make some revisions and everything. So we always come back to that so that we can say, okay, now are you ready to add another platform? Or now let's add in some more custom, really engaging type of content and up that. So that way, by building it more in increments and making sure we're executing along the way, it makes it a little bit more manageable because I believe that when it comes to marketing, less is more important. As long as you're being consistent, that's more important than trying to do everything. It's just, even if it's little things, just showing up consistently. I know in my business, I don't know what your experience, I'd be curious, David, but now that I've had my own business, I'm in my 4th year. I've started to have more and more people come to me and say, hey, I've been seeing what you've been posting and your webinars. We should talk, that are reaching out, but it's because I've been showing up consistently that entire time. And the challenge is we never know when that point's going to happen, right? It's that delayed gratification of, is that all of a sudden going to happen tomorrow? Or is that going to be a year from now? And just having faith and sticking with it long enough. What has been your experience with that?
I agree. And I want to plant a couple seeds. I want to comment on your own branding that you just kind of alluded to. I want to comment on the incremental improvements, and I want to share a client story about that stuff. But to answer your question, I noticed it in kind of 2 ways. So, and I share this with advisors when they start really focusing on building their brand. There's 3 circles of people that are going to see your content. The first circle of people is going to be a mixture of very close friends and family that you're already connected to. And it's going to be split down the middle between support and busting your chops, right? Because you're putting yourself out there and, friends and whatnot, that's just what they do. And you got to kind of, own that and deal with it. At least that's what I experienced. The second circle of people are people that you're second degree friends with and of each other. And it's oh, I see Jen or I see David, posting stuff now, cool, kind of stops there. And then you have this third circle of people on the other edge where they meet you where you're at that moment. So you don't necessarily know them. They don't really know you. And they just kind of view you in a certain way of this person is influential in nature. They're continuing to push out content. That content is super helpful. And what I experience is that third circle of people, they do business with you first because they met you as the expert. And then the second rung will start doing business with you over time. And then the third rung will eventually, fully support you and not just bust your chops because they realize, oh, wow, it's actually working. So as far as a time period, it varies based on, are you posting every day or once a week, or, what type of industry are you in general? But I kind of talk about those three circles. But I do want to comment on your own branding, because we are talking about branding, is on point, right? So Playmaker Coaching, you mentioned a couple words and phrases such as, we roll back the tapes, we see if that play is still working, and we want to so all that stuff is a fantastic example of branding. So I just want to emphasize that for other folks that may not have caught that as you were going through it. Also, as far as the incremental increases or improvements in what they're taking on, there's clients of mine, John and Matt. They have a practice just outside of the Orlando area in Florida, and they started with LinkedIn. And they started with LinkedIn, 4-ish years ago. Fast forward to today, they post almost every day on LinkedIn, on Facebook. They have a podcast they do, I think weekly or every other week, which then they splice up on Instagram. And they even have an Alexa skill. So if someone has an Alexa, they can say, hey, what's my daily briefing from John and Matt, or however the prompt is set up. And they get a daily briefing from them. So they started off with LinkedIn. Whereas if you went to an advisor, right, and you said, hey, so in order for this to work, you need to do all those things I just listed off, they're going to be like, no, Alexa skill, you lost me at that point. But if you can say, hey, start on LinkedIn, start on whatever platform, you build the smaller habits and then just layer on top of it. So I like that philosophy.
I love that you showed that example. I was on a call just like that earlier this week with a mastermind group, and somebody was asking about kind of setting up, how could they do more with kind of a funnel, and somebody else chimed in, and you could tell immediately that they started to shut down of like, that sounds great and totally overwhelming that I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
But like you said, if you start with just one piece of it, it's a lot easier just to get started while you're building that bigger system of where you want to go. That's really going to work. But if we try to bite it all off or put it all together at the beginning, it's just going to be too much versus how do we get to execution? Because ultimately we know that's what separates the best from the rest is the people that are going to execute. So the one other piece that you made me think about too, when you were talking about that, is just that ability to make sure that you're helping and providing value along the way of, it's not necessarily too all about what you put out, but it's also so much about just showing up for other people, commenting on their content, giving away things of, free resources like you've talked about before, add value for them. And for people that I know, a lot of advisors actually are like, I'm not very active on social. So they're like, how do I even get started? Sometimes we're like, just start by showing up for other people. And then you don't even have to worry about this, like, how much do I post or what do I put out? Let's just start there. And that alone can make a huge difference.
Yeah. That requires, I think, in the eyes of folks, more work than posting out content. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, if you want people to care about your stuff, it starts with caring about their stuff, right? And interacting with them to be able to get interaction from them eventually. I also am a big believer to make it easier to where they actually can start on multiple platforms at once without it being overwhelming, whether it's in a podcast format or a long form video, creating some sort of macro piece of content that can be spliced up over a series of weeks or months, is a way that you can kind of go across multiple platforms faster.
Yeah.
But I do think with an advisor skill set being an advisor, they need someone to help them with that. Otherwise, they'll get bogged down in the details and the fulfillment of, splicing all that stuff up.
Yeah, but even starting to create that library for content and how they can repurpose it. Yeah, I agree. It can make it so much easier because, a post that you shared, or I have, for instance, I have videos that I created probably 2 years ago. And, there's videos I can still reuse today and share because not everybody's going to see it the first time.
Yeah.
People are going to hear it with different ears every time that they hear it based off of what's going on in their business. So you can definitely reuse things. So that's what I'm a big fan of too, is how do we make it so that they don't have to feel like I'm always starting from scratch, but you have like, I know I'm going to talk about these things. This is the strategy. Like, here's how often maybe I'm going to talk about certain things and what my key themes are. And then I'm starting to build that library that I can just pull from, or at least if I have to create something new, it's a lot easier because I'm not just coming up with like, I don't even know where to start, or I don't have any ideas of what I can share. And then you're just randomly throwing stuff out there that doesn't even relate to your brand or your ideal client.
Yeah, for sure. And then real quick, and I want to talk about the playbook that you referenced earlier. The other thing I like about the longer form piece of content that you can splice up is from a compliance perspective, you just need to get that one piece approved, and then everything you splice up from there, is good to go. So it makes that process in and of itself more streamlined.
Oh yeah. Anytime you can make compliance easier, we know that's a win.
Also, if you are doing long form video and or a podcast, there's plenty of very cheap, if not free, AI tools that you can use to transcribe those, because compliance officers tend to like to read rather than listen or watch. So make their job easier. But talk to me about the playbook that you referenced earlier.
Yeah. So the playbook is all the different things that you might be doing within your marketing plan and everything. So it might be things like having a content plan and like, here's, how often we're going to post, and what we're hoping to get out of that. So we're always talking about how we're going to measure success and how often we're going to do things and who's responsible and all those aspects of it. But a content plan might be one of those plays. A influencer kind of plan might be speaking engagements. There's ones that we call kind of the MVP, because MVP, from a sports perspective is, those most valuable plays, but it's also from a business perspective, you might have heard the term minimum viable product. So it's the things that every advisor, no matter where you're at, should have. So that's the things like the content plan, your ideal client defined, a client engagement plan, a lead generation plan, because you're always going to have to ask. And referrals are probably, if you're a referral-based business, which most of us are, that's still probably going to be the most of where your leads are going to come from. But can you have more control and get another 20 or 30% through other avenues? I think you can, and marketing can certainly help with that, but we have to be intentional about that. So those are some of the MVP plans that we want to make sure that we're building for every advisor. Like I said, with phase one, it might be very basic. Like your client engagement plan might just be like, okay, I'm going to send everybody a gift at 4th of July, and I'm going to do one event for the year and stuff. And that's it and everything. And other people, it might be way more than that, but that's where it's making it fit for you and what we can do. So let's at least get all of those in place for you and make sure we're learning from those and adjusting through those. So that's the playbook that really helps us to make sure we're having that consistency of who's doing it, how often, and those quarterly reviews to make sure that we're evaluating the results that we're getting from it. The lead generation part of it is definitely one of the ones that we most often start with once we know their, their brand identity, because that really helps them get more specific around, for instance, one of my clients, Lauren, wanted to do speaking engagements. And she's like, yeah, that's going to be one of my avenues. I'm already doing a lot in that space. But once we dove into it and we actually said, well, how much of your business do you want to have come from speaking engagements? How confident do you feel like your ability to get there right now is based off of your success in the past? And then we were able to take that through a speaking value calculator to say, well, here's how many people you typically have in the audience and how many of those people set appointments with you. She was able to actually get very tangible and concrete steps to know, well, this is exactly how many speaking engagements I need to have to hit that revenue goal from that. Or, how can I make my speaking engagements much more effective so I convert more people in the audience? And we could dive into how to help her with her presentation. So that's where we can take it from being something of, okay, I'm going to have some centers of influence. I'm going to do some speaking and maybe I'll do a sponsorship or event, to really materializing that in a way that they can see results from.
Yeah, I think it's important to not just, and you alluded to this, but not just put together the actual plan, but come up with a plan of execution and a plan around how often are you going to review and kind of reassess if that plan should still be followed through with or not?
Yeah, definitely. That's probably the hardest part, right? It's like left to our own devices and everything. We're always like on to the next idea, or we just sometimes forget, like, why did I quit doing something that worked so well?
Right. Now, what's some of the things that, I'm looking through some of the notes that I took from our last call where we started scoping this out. And you mentioned something about, things that every advisor should have that a lot of advisors actually don't. And then you kind of, called it the glue that keeps everything working together. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So there's the two aspects. There's those MVP plays I was talking about, like having a content plan. Most people don't, they're just like, maybe I'm putting something out there on social, but they really don't have a plan for what kind of content are they putting out? How often is it going to be? What are they hoping to get from it? Client engagement plan. I think most people I talk to, they're like, hey, it's when I hear about something, maybe I try to send a baby gift or something, but they're like, I really don't know, what am I doing for my A's versus my B's or my influencers, partners, how am I take care of them? So a lot of those pieces, they have an idea in their head, but not necessarily something on paper. So we want to make sure that we get those. And then the wrapper, that glue that holds it all together, is really making sure that we have our strategy documents. We have a scorecard of like, what is success looking like, that we always review at least every quarter. We have those workflows documented. We have the calendar because that's the other thing too. If things don't get on the calendar, a lot of times it's just not going to happen. And we know there's other things going on. They're business owners. A lot of us have families. So if you want to take a vacation or something else is going on, like it's important that we have a line of sight to what else is going on. Maybe you're taking a credential, you're getting another CFP. Well, that might be something that takes you out a little bit. So we need to make sure from a marketing perspective, we're aware of that. So we're not trying to layer on too much at that same time if we don't have the resources for it while your priorities or your time is spent elsewhere. And then we have a marketing budget too, so that we know what kind of resources is it going to take to support what we're going to deliver. So all those are continue to be, evolving as we meet every quarter, but that's kind of the wrapper that makes sure that you're going to execute on those plays every quarter. And like I said, when we meet and we have those quarterly reviews, we always talk through, what's working, what's not working. And going back to the tape, because I know you like sports and everything. And if a team's lost more than 3 times, or at least by the time that they've lost that many, what do you always hear the coach say?
Oh, it's not a rhetorical question.
Oh, sorry. I put you on the spot. What does a coach say, when the team's lost multiple times?
We got to change something.
Yeah.
Because clearly what we're doing isn't working.
Yeah. So they're usually like, hey, we got to get back to the fundamentals, like, the blocking and tackling, like, let's get back to the fundamentals because, those are the things when executed correctly and consistently that then allow you to get to all these other like cool, awesome plays that are fancy. And everybody's like, oh, I want to do that. But you got to start with those fundamental plays to start with.
Love it. Yeah. I think too, like, just a nitty gritty example of what may come up if you do properly plan is, let's say during a particular quarter, an advisor is, going on vacation for a week or two, or, maybe they do like blitz style meetings where they have, all their meetings scrunched up into 1 month. And then the other 2 months are, open for prospecting and business development and whatnot. So making sure that during those times where time may be limited, that in advance so that you can batch your content in advance, schedule it to go out while you're away. So it doesn't look like you've taken the break, even though you actually have taken the break. Yeah. And without properly planning, you arrive, a couple of days before your vacation, you're like, oh crap, I didn't do my content for next week. And that, like you said before, consistency is key.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example. And the last thing I'll think about in terms of what we're talking about with the playbook is if you're in it, we'll take the example of a game since, I play sports, always have. And, I ultimately, the reason I called it Playmaker was because I realized what I did on the playing field was what I love doing for clients. It's just seeing how it all fits together and helping them play their position and the team score more. So I like to think about, if it's 4th down, 4th in inches and everything, or do you go for it or not? Would you go for it? What do you think?
I'm a risk taker. I would.
You go for it.
Personally.
So some people say, yeah, I'll go for it. Other people are like, no way, like pour down the statistics. And other people are saying, hey, I actually need more information, right? I want to know where I'm at on the field. I want to know who's playing, who's in the game, what the score is, how much time's left. So I think that's what having that playbook really allows us to do is we have all that other information so we can make better decisions rather than just maybe what our instinct is that may not necessarily be the best decision for us long term.
Well, I think that's all great stuff. I think it's given folks a good framework, a good playbook, if you will, on all the things that they need to take into consideration. And I think that if you didn't, as you were listening to this episode, I would go back and listen and take notes because Jen gave every little bit that you need to kind of put this stuff together. But before we wrap up, I do want to just pivot. So one of the things that we do with all of our guests, and if this is your first time listening to our podcast, we like to ask our guests about a book that's had an impact on them. And some guests have that exact book in mind. Other guests are juggling between a couple, 2, 3 books. And the whole point is to distill a reading list for everyone that's listening to the show. So Jen, there was, I think, 3 books that you had in mind, and I'd like to hear about all of them briefly. So one is One Word That Will Change Your Life. And pun fully intended, but how did that book change your life?
Yeah, so it's a one word. I heard about it originally. One of the authors, John Gordon, heard him speak. He talks about a lot of other things as well. And there are a couple of co-authors in that. And it's all about really thinking about like one theme for your life, or you can have it for your life, or I do this each year is typically what a lot of people do is kind of their intent. So I've been doing this since 2012, actually. Some of my early words were like curiosity or embrace. And when I go to develop my plans for the year and I'm thinking about a word, I'm always thinking about, well, what do I need this year? What do I feel like represents what I'm trying to aim for personally and professionally? And then that carries forward in everything that really ends on my business plan too, specifically around like, well, if this is the theme, this is really what I need, then what are the things I need to do around it? So for instance, the first year I started my business, my word was rise. So it was all about, hey, when it gets tough, how do I rise above it? How do I keep going and everything? And that was an important part of, doing my activity and showing up and staying with it, even when it's not easy. I've used champion, which was great because it tied in definitely in the sports theme as well. Last year, my word was light. And actually now we do it as a family every year. So I make my husband and daughter come up with a name word as well. We have a chalkboard in our kitchen table where we write it on. I have some stickers on my water bottles and laptop and stuff. And so ways to keep it in front of me, like this is what it's all about. So like with light last year is how do I make marketing light for my clients, lighter work for them? And how do I simplify things and, make things lighter in general and everything in my business as well? So that's really been instrumental. And I know you had a couple other books, so I won't take too much time on that. But that one is just the anchor for everything else for me.
Yeah, I was going to use the word anchor. And then the other word that came to mind is kind of like your North Star for the year. Like if you're ever feeling lost, you can just review what that word was. And it kind of gives you the insight or input as to what the next step needs to be.
Yeah. Helps me make decisions for sure.
Exactly. The other one that you mentioned too was the 4 tendencies.
Yeah. So that's by Gretchen Rubin. And this ties in well, I think, with some of what we were talking about too, about how do we execute and how do we follow through. A framework she uses around how we manage internal expectations that we have of ourselves, as well as how do we respond to expectations that other people place upon us. So there's 4 of them. So a quick way to kind of get a sense for which one you might be sometimes is to ask yourself, like, what do you feel about, do you like New Year's resolutions? What do you think about New Year's resolution, David? Are you all for them, or what's your thought around them?
I don't like to call them New Year's resolutions because I feel like they have a negative connotation around not being followed through on, but I do like the energy that the beginning of the year provides. So I love setting goals, but for those reasons, I don't call them New Year's resolutions.
Yeah. So each of them that can give us kind of a tip off, because obligers are typically the people that they need a lot of outside accountability. So they will be the person to say, hey, I don't make New Year's resolutions anymore because I never follow through on them. Like they're the ones that are like need to have somebody, a trainer that's going to meet them at the gym because otherwise they're not going to go work out. A questioner is going to say often like, well, I like them, but I want to customize it, or maybe I'm going to do it on January 5th because January 1st is just an arbitrary date. I'm going to do it on a date that makes sense for me. So they can tend to get struck in sometimes analysis paralysis though, because they want the optimal and efficient. So they'll follow other people's expectations if it makes sense for them. And then upholders tend to do good at both. They are rule followers. So sometimes they can be viewed a little bit rigid, and none of these are better than the others. But by understanding how we fit into it and how our clients fit into this, we can tailor our approach to what style is going to work for them in terms of helping them execute. And then rebels, they tend to say, hey, if somebody tells me I can't do something, then I'm probably going to do it because I like to prove people wrong. They're the ones that say, hey, I'll show you. But sometimes they struggle to follow through on their own expectations that they even have in themselves. So a lot of times they have to appeal to their sense of identity of what kind of person do I want to be? So that's really helped me working with some of my clients to understand if I try to say, hey, this is what, we need to get done maybe before our next meeting to move this forward. If they're a rebel, they might not do it just because somebody told them to do it. I'm like, that this is what we need to do versus, giving them more control, having them articulate it versus if they're a obliger, they probably need me to be more of here's the next step and I'm going to hold you accountable to it. Because otherwise they know they're not going to follow through on their own. So that's been really helpful. She's got a free, really quick quiz that you can take on her website. I'm sure we can share that with your audience as well, that I found really helpful in terms of understanding how I work, as well as how advisors I'm working with, what works best for them to help make sure that we're working together collectively.
We like similar sort of personality and style quizzes. We like going through 16 personalities. We also have our own personality test called Advisor DNA. And it's just insightful to, understand how to navigate through the various human tendencies and emotions and things like that.
Yeah. And I know, we've grown up in that where it's all these different assessments, you can understand so much about yourself and everything that can get overwhelming at times. But it's nice when you can kind of distill it down into a few key things of okay, this kind of makes sense and how I can use it.
Yeah. And then finally, find your yellow tux. I'm very curious about what that one is about.
Yeah. So Jesse Cole, he was a speaker at a conference I was at last year and just phenomenal. So he owns the Savannah Bananas and he really talks about, if you can get your brand down to one word, what are you in the business of? And while he owns the Savannah Bananas, a baseball team, minor league baseball team, he's really in the brand of entertainment. He's providing entertainment. So he's completely transformed how you experience a baseball game, maybe from what, would be traditional, because people don't want to wait for hours and hours. They don't want to be charged nickel and dime for everything, so he completely took this away and say, if our goal is really to provide entertainment, let's not get stuck in the box of this is what a baseball game looks like. How do we entertain? And constantly reinventing and trying new things. And he'll say, some things they've done have failed completely and other things that have worked tremendously well. And, just how do you set yourself apart? You've got to be different and you got to be continually trying new things.
Yeah. Not to get too specific along that example and too off topic, but anytime I go to a AAA baseball game, I feel like they do a great job engaging the crowd. So a little bit of a tangent, but
yeah.
Now, Jen, this has been an absolute pleasure. And if I'm listening to this and I say, hey, I love that information, I may need some help and some hand-holding in actually putting this together and being held accountable, what's the best way to get in touch with you to learn more?
Yeah. So it can certainly reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn or Instagram, or my website is playmakercoach.com, and connect with me there. And I think, for those two that, want to get started with this, a great first place to start is they can get their marketing playbook template that they can use with their teams to start to get some of this down and think about these maybe in a more intentional way than what they've done possibly in the past. And it really allows them to identify some of those new plays too, maybe that they haven't thought about for this coming year that can help support their business goals. And it's really just a step-by-step approach that they can use. To get it, you can just email me, Jennifer@playmakercoach.com, and I'll send that to you. And then along with that, once you get that, you can schedule a 30-minute one-on-one with me. So we can talk through any questions you might have or anything that you're like, hey, I want a little bit more clarification on this, or how do I actually get started executing this part of it? Love to have that one-on-one conversation to help them take that and start to put that into place.
Well, if you're listening to this and you have not yet put together your plan for 2023, I would definitely take Jen up on that offer. And Jen, it was a pleasure. I know you and I, as well as some other folks in the industry, are working on something. You just sent an email out the other day. So we'll be seeing more of each other, but appreciate you joining on the show and looking forward to continuing to hang out moving forward.
Yeah, me too. Looking forward to it. Always great to connect and excited for all the possibilities of what's to come this next year.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for listening. Have a great rest of your day.